The title of this sermon this week is Resurrection Takes Time. Do you believe that the resurrection of Jesus occurred at the moment of his death when God raised him from the dead? Well, according to the writers of the New Testament Gospels, disciples did not. According to John's Gospel and what we now refer to as the first Easter, one of Jesus' female followers named Mary Magdalene, who witnessed his crucifixion, visited his tomb 3 days later. Naturally, assuming his dead body was in the tomb, she'd gone there to show her respects and to grieve over her loss. But much to her consternation, when Mary arrived at the tomb in the darkness of morning, she discovered that the stone that had enclosed the tomb had been rolled away. Either from looking in the tomb and discovering it was empty, or just assuming it was, Mary ran and went to Peter and the one we know as the beloved disciple and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and I don't know where they've laid him." Instead of experiencing resurrection on that first Easter, then, Mary experienced only the anxiety of believing the body of Jesus had been stolen and therefore desecrated. After receiving Mary's troubling news about Jesus, Peter and the beloved disciple ran back to the tomb to confirm what Mary had told them. There they indeed found the stone had been rolled away, and when they looked and went in, they found only grave clothes and no body of Jesus. John does not say that the empty tomb caused Peter to believe that Jesus had been resurrected. And even though John did write that when the beloved disciple looked in, he believed, I've always taken this to mean believed in Mary's testimony rather than in Jesus' resurrection. The proof of this is that when Peter and the beloved disciple returned home, John did not say that they proclaimed the good news of the resurrection of Jesus. Instead, he only wrote that the two disciples simply went back to their homes. Now, when Mary returned to the tomb after Peter and the beloved disciple had departed, instead of rejoicing in the empty tomb being proof of Jesus' resurrection, John wrote that Mary simply stood outside of it weeping, not just over the death of Jesus, but over the fact that his body had been stolen. It was only after angels asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" and a man she thought was a gardener asked the same question, that Mary gave her answer, "Because they've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." It was only after the supposed gardener addressed Mary by name that she recognized the voice to be that of Jesus in his resurrected body. So for Mary then, who was the first to visit Jesus' tomb after his death and burial, resurrection takes time. When Mary goes back and witnesses the resurrection to the other disciples, saying, "I've seen the Lord," apparently her testimony does not convince them either. Another gospel writer said that they dismissed it as an idle tale born out of hysteria and wish fulfillment. This is where Sunday's gospel lesson from John picks up. It's evening on that first Easter, and Jesus' disciples are huddled together behind closed and locked doors, afraid that authorities will come and arrest them too, and they'll meet the same fate as Jesus. It's then that the resurrected Jesus comes and stands among them and says, "Peace be with you," and shows them his hands and side, which leads them to rejoice that they've seen their Lord. Now, one of the disciples named Thomas was not there when the resurrected Jesus appeared. When the other disciples told Thomas what they'd seen, he declared that he would not believe until he saw it for himself and actually touched the marks of Jesus' crucified body. Had the disciples minus Thomas seen a mere apparition or the risen Jesus? Did they now finally believe in his resurrection and experience their own? John's unfolding story seems to indicate otherwise. For 7 days pass, and the disciples are still huddled in fear behind closed and locked doors. This time, Thomas is with them, and again Jesus appears to them and tries to allay their fears by saying, "Peace be with you." Seeing Thomas, Jesus invites him to touch his hands and side, and it's in seeing and in Jesus' invitation to touch him that Thomas is finally led to belief that had him exclaim, "My Lord and my God." For Jesus' first disciples, then, resurrection takes time. A day for one and possibly others, and 8 days for another. Now, a week has also passed for us since Easter, not the first one, but Easter 2020. We weren't able to attend church because the coronavirus pandemic. Instead, we were only able to hear our choir sing hymns like Christ the Lord is risen today. And we were able to hear the story of Jesus' resurrection read and preached on. For some of this affirmed our belief in Jesus' resurrection and caused us to experiencing one of our own. But for others of us, resurrection was something we just heard as a story and something we might not have even heard if we didn't log into our church website. Easter Sunday has now come and gone, and we're still living in mandated isolation in our homes, locked behind closed doors, as Jesus' disciples were after their first Easter. Like Mary Magdalene, we too are filled with consternation, not over the empty tomb and where his body has been placed, but over the uncertainty of how long the coronavirus pandemic will last. Like Jesus' first disciples, we too are huddled behind locked doors in fear, not from being arrested, tried, and crucified, but from being infected by a potentially life-threatening virus. Like Mary Magdalene, who wept for the loss of Jesus at the tomb, we weep for our losses, not only those we know have died, but the loss of human contact, freedoms we hold dear, and our way of life, including gathering in our church as a community of faith. Like Thomas, we have our own doubts and are left bargaining with God. If you do this for me and get me through this pandemic unscathed, then I'll believe and follow you. My friends, it takes time for winter to turn into spring. It takes time for consternation to turn into calm and peace. It takes time for sorrow to turn into joy. It takes time for bargaining to turn into acceptance. And it takes time for brokenness and hurt to heal and forgiveness to take place. Leo Tolstoy began his last novel, Resurrection, as I mentioned last Sunday, with a vivid description of spring coming to a 19th century Russian city after one of its typically long, cold, and hard winters. He used this as a metaphor for a story between a wealthy Russian prince and a poor peasant girl. The prince seduced the peasant, left her in a family way, and abandoned her, which caused her to descend into a life of degradation and prostitution. 10 years later, the now peasant woman stood trial, charged with the murder of a client she only accidentally killed. As fate would have it, the prince observed her trial. Unable to speak out on the woman's behalf and confess that he was the source of her misfortune, the prince watched as she was sentenced to 4 years in hard labor in Siberia. Overcome with guilt for what he had done, the prince visited the peasant woman in prison, confessed, and asked for forgiveness. At first, the peasant woman was understandably unwilling to forgive the prince, but when he visited her daily and tried to atone for his sins with the proposal of marriage, her heart began to soften, and forgiveness, both for the prince and the peasant woman, occurred. Resurrection takes time. Sometimes resurrection can be instantaneous and be caused by something like a life-altering experience which changes us forever. But more often than not, resurrection takes time, like it will take time for us to feel safe to go outside after the pandemic is over, as it took time for the disciples to feel safe to go outside after Jesus' death and resurrection. It might not be easy for us to believe that resurrection is possible for our world, our country, for our church, and even for ourselves, especially in the middle of a pandemic. It might take time to believe that God can still make it all possible, that as he raised Jesus from the dead, so too can he raise us. It will take time, but that time will come.